2 Apache women were found in the cold. The rancher took them in, gave them the shelter they needed. The morning came quietly, but the cold was sharp and heavy. Frost covered the ground like a thin white blanket, and every breath felt painful in the lungs. The sun had not fully risen yet, and the sky was pale and dull. A rancher named Thomas rode his horse slowly along the far edge of his land, checking fences the way he did every winter morning. This land was wide and lonely, and winters here showed no mercy. Thomas had lived on this ranch for most of his life. He knew the land well, every curve of the creek, every old tree, every place where animals liked to hide from the wind. That morning, the cold felt worse than usual. Even his horse seemed uneasy, stamping its feet and shaking its head as if asking to return home. As Thomas rode closer to the frozen creek, something dark near the ground caught his eye. At first he thought it was a fallen tree branch or maybe a pile of old cloth left by travelers. He slowed his horse, squinting through the thin morning light. The shape did not move, and that made him uneasy. He guided the horse closer, the sound of frozen grass crunching under its hooves. As he came near, his heart tightened. What he saw was not an object. It was 2 people. 2 women were lying close together near the creek bank, curled into themselves as if trying to share warmth. Their clothes were worn and thin, not made for this kind of cold. Their dark hair was tangled, and their faces were pale. One of them stirred slightly, letting out a weak breath that formed a small cloud in the air. Thomas quickly dismounted, his hands already numb as he pulled his gloves tighter. He knelt beside them, unsure what to do first. They were alive, but just barely. Their bodies were stiff from the cold, and their lips were dry and cracked. It was clear they had been exposed to the freezing weather for far too long. For a moment, Thomas froze, not from the cold, but from fear and uncertainty. He could tell from their features and clothing that they were Apache women. Everyone in the area knew stories, warnings, and rumors. People talked about danger, about trouble, about keeping distance. Those stories had been passed around for years, shaping fear in quiet ways. Thomas felt that fear now, pressing against his chest. Helping them could bring problems. Someone might see, someone might talk. In this land and time, choices like this were not simple. But then one of the women opened her eyes. They were dark, tired, and filled with fear. She tried to speak, but no sound came out. Her lips moved, and her hand twitched weakly against the frozen ground. That small movement changed everything. Thomas removed his coat without thinking. The cold bit into him immediately, but he did not care. He carefully covered both women, wrapping the coat around their shoulders and backs. He spoke softly, even though he did not know if they understood his words. "It's all right," he said gently. "You're not alone now." The women did not respond, but their breathing became slightly steadier. Thomas looked around, checking the open land. No one else was nearby. The wind whistled through dry grass, carrying the quiet danger of winter. He knew he could not leave them there, not in this cold. Not in this condition. Thomas went back to his horse and pulled out his water flask. He knelt again and carefully helped one woman take a small sip. Her hands were shaking so badly that he had to hold the flask himself. He gave the other woman a few drops as well, careful not to rush them. Their skin felt icy to the touch. Thomas had seen animals freeze before. He knew the signs. Time was running out. Lifting them would not be easy. They were weak, and he did not want to hurt them. Slowly, carefully, he helped one woman to sit up. She leaned heavily against him, barely able to hold her head up. The other woman tried to move but fell back, her strength gone. Thomas took a deep breath. He made a decision in that moment, one that would change more than just this morning. He helped them both onto his horse, arranging them as safely as he could. One woman clung weakly to the saddle horn, while the other rested against Thomas's chest as he walked beside the horse, holding her steady. The ride back to the ranch felt longer than usual. The wind cut through his shirt without the coat, and his fingers ached with cold. But he did not slow down, every step mattered. As they approached the ranch house, smoke rose gently from the chimney. That sight gave Thomas a small sense of hope, warmth, shelter, safety. His wife Margaret opened the door when she heard the horse. Her face shifted from surprise to concern the moment she saw the women. She did not ask questions. She did not hesitate. "Get them inside," she said firmly. Together, they helped the women into the house. Margaret quickly brought blankets, wrapping them layer by layer. She warmed water on the stove and prepared simple food. The room filled with the sound of crackling fire and quiet movement. The women were placed near the hearth. Their hands were slowly rubbed to bring feeling back. The ranch house, usually quiet and simple, now held a heavy silence mixed with concern. Thomas stood back, watching. His body was shaking now that the urgency had slowed. He realized how cold he was, but he ignored it. The women slowly opened their eyes again. Their expressions were guarded, uncertain. Fear still lived there, but confusion and exhaustion were stronger. Margaret offered them warm broth, using gentle movements and calm expressions. One woman hesitated before taking a sip. The other watched closely, studying every detail of the room, the people, the fire. Trust did not come easily. Thomas understood that. He kept his distance, sitting on a chair near the door, giving them space. He did not want to frighten them further. He knew they had likely faced danger before finding themselves at the creek. As the warmth spread through their bodies, small changes appeared. Their breathing became deeper. Their hands stopped shaking as much. One of the women whispered something softly in her own language, her voice barely more than air. Thomas could not understand the words, but he understood the feeling behind them. Relief, pain, survival. Outside, the sun finally rose higher, casting pale light across the land. The frozen world remained harsh and unforgiving, but inside the ranch house, something different existed. A fragile pause, a moment where kindness had stepped in before it was too late. Thomas knew that what he had done could bring consequences. People might talk. Rumors might spread, but as he watched the women slowly recover by the fire, he felt no regret. That morning had started like any other winter day. Fence lines, cold air, quiet land. It ended with lives saved and a choice made that could not be taken back. And though no one spoke it aloud, everyone in that room understood one truth clearly. If Thomas had arrived even a little later, the cold would have claimed them forever. The house felt different after that first morning. The fire stayed lit all day, and the smell of warm food slowly replaced the sharp scent of cold that had followed the women inside. Outside, the wind continued to move across the land, but within the walls of the ranch house, time seemed to slow. Thomas did not go back out to his work that day. He stayed close, watching quietly from a distance. Margaret moved around the house with steady hands, bringing water, checking the fire, and making sure the blankets stayed wrapped tightly around the two women. Neither of them spoke much. Their eyes followed every movement, careful and alert, as if they were waiting for something bad to happen. By afternoon, the color slowly returned to their faces. One of the women sat up slightly, wincing as she moved. She held her side as if it ached deeply. Margaret noticed and gently helped her adjust the blankets. She spoke softly, using calm tones, even though she knew the women might not understand her words. Kindness, she believed, did not need translation. Thomas noticed small details. One woman appeared older, her face marked by long years of hardship. The other was younger, her eyes sharper despite her weakness. They stayed close together, often touching hands, reminding Thomas of how people hold on to each other when the world feels unsafe. As the day passed, Thomas's thoughts grew heavier. Helping them had felt natural in the moment, but now the weight of the decision settled in. He knew how people in the nearby town talked. Fear traveled faster than truth. If word spread that he was sheltering Apache women, some might see it as a threat. Margaret sensed his worry without him saying a word. That evening, as she stirred a pot near the stove, she spoke quietly. "You did the right thing," she said. Thomas nodded but did not reply. He stared into the fire, watching the flames dance and break apart. "Right doesn't always mean easy," he finally said. That night they prepared simple sleeping spaces near the fire. The women were too weak to climb stairs, so blankets were laid on the floor where the warmth would reach them. Thomas slept lightly, waking often at every sound. Each creak of the house made his heart jump. The next morning brought new challenges. One of the women woke early and tried to stand on her own. She lost balance and nearly fell before Thomas caught her. She stiffened at his touch, fear flashing across her face. Thomas immediately stepped back, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm sorry," he said slowly, hoping his tone would carry meaning. The woman studied him for a long moment, then nodded slightly. She pointed to herself and spoke a word Thomas did not understand. Then she pointed to the other woman and said another word. Names, perhaps. Or something close to them. Thomas pointed to his chest. "Thomas," he said. The woman repeated it softly, testing the sound. It was the first small bridge between them. Margaret brought food, and this time the women ate more willingly. They still watched carefully, but hunger overcame fear. The younger woman ate quickly, while the older one took slow, careful bites. Later that day, Thomas rode into town. He did not tell Margaret he planned to go, but she understood. Supplies were needed, and he needed to hear what people were saying. He wrapped himself warmly and set off, his mind restless. The town was quiet, but familiar faces greeted him. Conversation stopped when he approached. A few men nodded politely, but others watched him closely. At the supply store, someone mentioned seeing signs near the creek. Another spoke of travelers passing through. Thomas listened more than he spoke. One man leaned closer and lowered his voice. "Be careful out there," he said. "Strange things happening." Thomas thanked him and left quickly. On the ride back, his stomach tightened. No one knew yet, but it would not stay that way forever. Back at the ranch, the women were resting. Margaret whispered that the older woman had tried to help fold cloth earlier, insisting on doing something useful. Despite her weakness, she wanted to contribute. That small act moved Thomas deeply. That evening, the younger woman stood near the window, looking out at the land. Her eyes were filled with longing, as if she was thinking of places far away. She pressed her palm lightly against the glass. Thomas followed her gaze. "It's a hard land," he said softly. She looked at him, then slowly nodded. As days passed, strength returned bit by bit. The women still spoke very little, but gestures became clearer. They helped with small tasks, sorting beans, holding tools, carrying light items. Margaret watched carefully, making sure they did not overexert themselves. One afternoon, a rider passed near the ranch. The sound of hooves sent tension through the house like a sudden storm. The younger woman stiffened, her breathing quickening. The older woman grabbed her hand tightly. Thomas stepped outside to meet the rider before he came closer. It was only a neighbor checking fence lines, but the fear that moment caused stayed long after the rider left. That night, Thomas and Margaret spoke in hushed voices. "They're scared," Margaret said, "and I don't blame them." Thomas rubbed his face tiredly. "I don't know how long we can keep this hidden." "Do you want to send them away?" Margaret asked gently. He looked toward the fire where the women slept quietly. "Not yet," he said firmly. "Not like this." The women seemed to sense the growing tension. The older one spoke one evening, her voice soft but serious. She used gestures, pointing outside, then back toward herself, then making a motion of walking away. Thomas understood enough. She was offering to leave. "No," he said quickly. He shook his head and placed a hand over his heart. "Stay, safe." The woman studied his face, then slowly lowered her hands. Tears welled in her eyes, though she quickly wiped them away. Winter stretched on. Snow fell lightly one night, covering the land in silence. Inside the house, warmth and routine continued. Trust grew not through words, but through shared moments, quiet meals, small smiles, understanding looks. But beyond the ranch, the world did not pause. One evening, distant voices carried through the cold air. Thomas stepped outside and saw a lantern light far off near the road. His heart raced. Someone was nearby. He returned inside, closing the door carefully. The women noticed immediately. Fear returned to their faces, sharp and sudden. Thomas spoke calmly. "Stay inside," he said, though he knew they might not fully understand. He stood near the window, watching until the lights passed without stopping. That night, sleep did not come easily. The risk he had taken was no longer just his own. It affected everyone under that roof. As the fire burned low and the women slept once more, Thomas realized something important. Taking them in had not been a single act of kindness. It was a promise, one that required courage every day it was kept. And with each passing night, the cost of that promise grew heavier. The days began to settle into a quiet rhythm. Morning light came through the small windows, soft and pale, touching the walls and the floor. The fire was always the first thing tended to. Margaret rose early, adding wood and warming water, while Thomas stepped outside to check the animals and the sky. Winter still held the land tightly, but the worst cold had passed. Inside the house, the two women slowly became part of the daily life. They moved carefully, still weak but stronger than before. Their steps were slow, their bodies cautious, as if they did not fully trust the ground beneath their feet yet. Thomas noticed how they always stayed aware of doors, windows, and sounds. Survival had taught them to be alert at all times. The older woman had a calm presence. She watched more than she acted, her eyes taking in every detail. The younger one was restless. She paced near the window sometimes, looking out at the open land, her face filled with thoughts she did not share. When Thomas caught her staring into the distance, he wondered what memories lived behind her quiet eyes. Margaret found ways to communicate without words. She smiled often, nodded gently, and showed things instead of explaining them. When she cooked, she let the women see how she measured grain and stirred pots. When she folded cloth, she handed them pieces to help. Slowly, very slowly, walls began to lower. One afternoon, Margaret placed a small basket of beans on the table and gestured for help. The younger woman hesitated, then sat down and began sorting them carefully. Her hands moved with skill, practiced and steady. The older woman joined her, and soon the three women sat together in silence, working side by side. Thomas watched from the doorway. The sight filled him with a quiet warmth. There was no fear in that moment, just people sharing a task. As the women healed, small details of their past became visible. Thomas noticed old marks on their hands, signs of long work and travel. He saw how the older woman sometimes touched a small piece of cloth tied around her wrist, as if it carried meaning. He did not ask. Some stories were not meant to be spoken. One evening, as the fire burned low, the younger woman picked up a piece of charcoal from near the hearth. She knelt and began drawing on a flat stone. Her movements were careful but confident. Lines formed shapes, mountains, a river, figures walking together. Thomas and Margaret watched quietly. When she finished, she pointed to the figures, then to herself and the older woman. Then she pointed far beyond the stone, toward the door, toward the land beyond. They had traveled far. Thomas nodded slowly. "You're safe here," he said gently, placing a hand on his chest. He did not know if she understood the words, but she seemed to understand the meaning. She pressed her hand briefly against her own chest in return. Trust grew in small moments like that. But healing was not only physical. Some nights, Thomas heard soft sounds from near the fire, quiet breaths, sudden movements, the sharp intake of air. The women slept lightly, often waking as if from troubling dreams. Margaret would sit nearby, silent and steady, offering comfort simply by being there. One night, the older woman spoke in a low voice, her words flowing softly in a language Thomas could not understand. Her voice carried weight, as if she were telling a story or offering reassurance. The younger woman listened closely, her body slowly relaxing as the words continued. Thomas realized then that survival had bound them together deeply. They carried each other through fear and hardship, just as they carried each other now through recovery. Outside the ranch, the world remained uncertain. Thomas still heard rumors in town. He still noticed eyes lingering on him longer than before. But nothing had happened yet, and for that he was grateful. Back at the house, routine became comfort. Morning meals, quiet afternoons, evenings by the fire. The women helped where they could, careful not to draw attention. They washed dishes, swept floors, and carried water when allowed. Margaret had to remind them often to rest. One afternoon, a storm rolled in unexpectedly. Wind shook the house, and snow began to fall thick and fast. The sound of it startled the younger woman. She stood quickly, her breathing quick and shallow. The older woman moved to her side, placing a steady hand on her arm. Thomas closed the shutters and added wood to the fire. "It's all right," he said calmly, "just weather." The storm passed by morning, leaving the world white and quiet. The land looked peaceful, but Thomas knew how easily beauty could hide danger. As strength returned, the women began to talk more to each other in soft voices. Thomas caught pieces of emotion in their tones, sadness, relief, longing. He respected their privacy, listening only enough to sense their feelings. One day, the older woman surprised Margaret by offering to help mend a tear in a blanket. She gestured toward the needle and thread. Margaret smiled and handed them over. The woman worked carefully, her hands steady despite their past weakness. When she finished, she held the blanket out proudly. Margaret touched her heart in thanks. The older woman smiled softly. That smile stayed with Thomas long after. But not all moments were peaceful. Late one afternoon, the sound of distant voices drifted across the land again. The younger woman froze instantly. Fear flashed across her face, raw and sharp. She moved toward the corner of the room, her eyes darting. Thomas stepped outside to listen. The voices belonged to travelers passing by, their laughter carried by the wind. They did not stop. Still, the tension lingered long after the sounds faded. That night, Thomas realized how fragile safety truly was. The women were healing, but the fear they carried could not be erased by warmth alone. He sat at the table, staring at his hands. "How long can this last?" he whispered to Margaret. She met his eyes steadily. "As long as it needs to." The next day, Thomas brought out an old map. He laid it on the table and pointed to different places, watching the women's reactions. The younger woman leaned closer, her finger tracing a line along the map until she stopped at a spot far away. She nodded firmly. "Home." The older woman looked at her with concern, then at Thomas. She shook her head slowly, gesturing to the snow outside. Not yet. Thomas understood. The land was still dangerous. Winter still ruled. Days turned into weeks. The women's strength continued to grow. They laughed softly once, startled by their own sound. It was a small laugh, but it filled the room like sunlight. Thomas realized how much they had already changed the house. It no longer felt lonely. It felt alive with quiet understanding. Yet deep inside, he knew this could not last forever. One evening, the younger woman stood by the door, her hand resting on the wood. She looked back at Thomas, then at Margaret. Her eyes were filled with gratitude and sadness. Change was coming. The older woman joined her, placing a hand on her shoulder. They spoke softly to each other, then turned together toward the fire one last time. Thomas felt a tightening in his chest. He did not know what the future held, but he knew one thing clearly. These women were no longer just people he had saved from the cold. They were part of his story now, and whatever came next would test the strength of the trust they had built, slowly, quietly, one day at a time. The change did not arrive suddenly. It came slowly, like a shadow stretching longer each evening. Thomas felt it in the way the land seemed quieter than usual, in the way sounds carried farther across the open space. Even the animals sensed it. The horses were restless, and the dogs barked at small noises that once would not have bothered them. Inside the house, the women felt it too. The younger one spent more time near the windows, watching the road and the hills beyond. The older woman became quieter, her calm face thoughtful, as if she were measuring time in her own way. They spoke to each other more often now, their voices low and serious. Margaret noticed the shift first. One morning, as she kneaded dough at the table, she glanced up and saw the younger woman standing stiffly near the door, her eyes fixed on something outside. Margaret followed her gaze and saw nothing at first. Then far away, a thin line of dust rose briefly before settling again. Someone had passed by. Thomas returned from the barn moments later, his expression tight. "I saw riders," he said quietly. "Not close, but close enough." No one spoke after that. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the room. The women exchanged a look. The younger one took a small step forward and spoke, her words flowing quickly, her hands moving with meaning. She pointed to herself, then to the road, then made a motion of walking away. Her eyes were firm. She was ready to leave. The older woman reached for her arm gently, speaking in a slower tone. Her face showed concern. She gestured toward the snow still clinging to shaded ground, toward the hills where cold winds still ruled. It was too soon. Thomas understood both sides without needing the words. He raised his hand slowly, trying to calm the moment. "No one's forcing anything," he said softly. "You're safe here, for now." The younger woman looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, though the tension did not leave her face. That afternoon, Thomas rode into town again, his heart heavy. He needed to know what people were saying. At the supply store, conversation stopped when he entered. A few men nodded, but their eyes held questions. One man spoke carefully. "Heard there's been movement near the creek," he said. "People are nervous." Thomas kept his voice steady. "It's winter," he replied. "Travelers pass through." The man studied him, then looked away. "Just be careful." Thomas left with supplies tied tightly behind his saddle. As he rode home, he felt the weight of every mile. Silence was becoming harder to keep. Back at the ranch, Margaret greeted him with a look that told him she already sensed trouble. He shook his head slightly, letting her know nothing had happened yet. Still, the air felt tight. That night the women packed small bundles without being asked. They folded cloth, tied food carefully, and set the bundles near the door. Margaret watched with a heavy heart. "You don't have to go," she said gently, though she knew words alone might not stop what was coming. The older woman stepped forward. She placed a hand over her heart, then touched Margaret's arm softly. Her eyes were filled with gratitude and sadness mixed together. She spoke quietly, her tone warm and steady. Margaret nodded, tears burning behind her eyes. Thomas stood near the fire, his hands clenched. "If you leave," he said slowly, "it should be when it's safer." The younger woman shook her head slightly. She pointed outside, then made a motion of listening. She was right. Danger did not wait for the perfect moment. Before dawn the next morning, distant voices drifted across the land again. This time, they were closer. Lantern light flickered faintly near the road. Everyone woke instantly. The younger woman grabbed her bundle, her breathing quick but controlled. The older woman took her hand firmly. They looked to Thomas, then to Margaret, waiting. Thomas felt his chest tighten. Every choice felt heavy now. He stepped outside briefly, listening carefully. The voices passed by slowly, then faded. Whoever it was did not stop, for now. Thomas returned inside and closed the door softly. "Stay," he said, "just until daylight." The women hesitated, then agreed. Morning came gray and quiet. Snow clouds hung low, making the world feel smaller. Thomas knew they could not delay much longer. After breakfast, the older woman spoke at length, her hands moving gently as she explained something important. She pointed to the map again, to the distant place the younger woman had marked before. Then she gestured between herself and the younger woman, then toward Thomas and Margaret. Thomas understood. They would leave soon, but not without saying goodbye properly. Margaret prepared food for the journey, wrapping it carefully. She added extra cloth and small supplies, pressing them into the women's hands despite their protests. "Take it," she said softly. "Please." The younger woman's eyes filled and she bowed her head slightly. Outside, Thomas saddled a horse and led it forward. He showed them a safer path, one less traveled, pointing out landmarks and places to rest. The women watched closely, memorizing every detail. Before leaving, the older woman stepped toward Thomas. She reached into her bundle and pulled out the small cloth she always kept tied to her wrist. She placed it in his hand. Thomas shook his head at first, but she closed his fingers around it firmly. Her eyes were kind and serious. A gift of thanks, a memory. The younger woman stepped forward next. She placed her hand briefly over Thomas's heart, then over her own. No words were needed. Margaret embraced them gently, holding on for a moment longer than expected. The women allowed it, their arms stiff at first, then slowly returning the gesture. When they turned to leave, the house felt suddenly empty. Thomas walked with them a short distance, guiding them past the first ridge. The wind picked up, carrying the sound of the ranch farther away with every step. At the crest of the hill, they stopped. The younger woman looked back once, her face strong but sad. The older woman raised her hand in farewell. Thomas stood there long after they disappeared into the land. The ride back to the house felt heavy. Margaret was quiet, moving through the room slowly, touching objects the women had used. The fire burned low. They both knew the danger was not over. That evening, a knock came at the door. Thomas's heart raced. He opened it carefully. Two men stood outside, their expressions serious but not hostile. They asked simple questions about the land, about travelers, about anything unusual. Thomas answered calmly, truthfully, without offering more than needed. The men thanked him and left. When the door closed, Margaret exhaled shakily. "They were just here," she whispered. Thomas nodded. "I know." That night, sleep did not come easily. Thomas lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the small cloth gift resting in his hand. He thought of the cold morning by the creek, of fear and trust, of choices made without time to think. He did not know if the women would reach their destination safely. He did not know if helping them would bring trouble later, but he knew one thing clearly. When faced with the cold, with fear, with the chance to turn away, he had chosen to open his door. And no matter what followed, that choice had already shaped his life forever. The days after their departure felt unusually quiet. The ranch seemed larger, emptier, as if the land itself had noticed the absence. Thomas moved through his routines more slowly now. He still rose before sunrise, still checked the animals and fences, but every familiar task carried a sense of waiting. Margaret felt it too. She kept the fire going, cooked meals, and cleaned the house, yet her hands often paused for no clear reason. Sometimes she looked toward the place near the hearth where the women had slept, as if expecting to see them there again. The blankets were folded neatly, but the warmth they once held was gone. Winter finally began to loosen its grip. Snow melted into thin streams that ran quietly across the ground. The creek, once frozen and silent, began to move again. With the change of season came relief, but also worry. Thomas often found himself scanning the horizon, wondering if the women were safe, if they had found shelter, if the land had been kinder to them than it usually was. Life in town returned to its usual pace. People talked about planting plans, repairs, and trade. A few travelers passed through, but no one asked questions anymore. The moment of danger had passed, at least for now. Still, Thomas stayed alert. Some habits did not fade easily. One afternoon, Thomas rode out to the creek. He dismounted and stood where he had first found the women, the memory clear and sharp in his mind. The ground looked ordinary now, washed clean by melting snow. Anyone passing by would never know what had happened there. He took the small cloth from his pocket. It was worn, simple, but carefully made. He held it for a long moment, then tied it gently to a low tree branch nearby, not as a marker for others but as a quiet reminder for himself. Spring brought new work. Fences needed mending, animals needed care, and fields needed preparation. The ranch slowly filled with sound again, birds returning, wind moving through fresh grass, tools striking earth. With each passing day, life pushed forward. Yet the experience stayed with Thomas and Margaret. It changed how they saw the world. Small things mattered more now. A shared meal, a warm fire, a door opened without hesitation. One evening, Margaret placed an extra bowl on the table without realizing it. She noticed only when Thomas sat down and looked at it quietly. She sighed softly and removed it. "Old habits," she said. Thomas nodded. "Not a bad thing." Weeks passed. One morning, a rider approached the ranch slowly. Thomas stepped outside, cautious but calm. The rider was a trader he recognized, someone who traveled long distances and knew many routes. They spoke briefly about weather and roads. As the trader prepared to leave, he hesitated. "I met two women on the southern trail," he said casually. "Strong walkers, quiet. They asked for directions and moved on." Thomas felt his heart tighten. "Were they all right?" he asked carefully. The trader nodded, looked tired but determined. They knew where they were going. Thomas thanked him and watched as the rider disappeared into the distance. That night he told Margaret. She smiled softly, relief washing over her face. Neither of them said much after that. They did not need to. Time continued its steady march. Summer followed spring, bringing heat and long days. The ranch thrived. Crops grew well, animals stayed healthy, and the land felt generous. One afternoon, Margaret found herself humming while she worked. She paused, surprised by the sound. Joy had returned quietly without asking permission. Thomas noticed changes in himself too. He listened more, spoke less. He judged less quickly, remembering how easily fear could shape a story before truth ever arrived. Sometimes, neighbors spoke harshly about people they did not understand. Thomas did not argue, but he no longer nodded along either. Silence, he had learned, could be its own choice. Late one evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in soft colors, Thomas and Margaret sat outside, watching the light fade. The land stretched wide and peaceful before them. "Do you think they'll remember us?" Margaret asked quietly. Thomas looked at the horizon. "I think so," he said. "Not for what we gave them, but for what we didn't take away." Margaret nodded, understanding. Years would pass. Seasons would change again and again. New stories would come and go. But that winter would remain fixed in their memories, clear and lasting. Not because it was dangerous, not because it brought fear, but because in the coldest moment they chose kindness. And that choice, simple and quiet, became something greater than they ever expected. It became proof that even in hard times, humanity could still find a way to stand together, if only for a moment, and help one another survive.